Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's recording of Paideia Today. I'm Scott Masson with my colleague Bill Friesen here. Today, we're looking at another wonderful American writer by the name of William Faulkner. Faulkner is well known for his novels and short stories set in the Old South. Faulkner himself spent most of his life there in Mississippi. He's certainly one of the great writers of American literature, and in particular of the genre that we would categorize as Southern Gothic, which we've already addressed with Flannery O'Connor. But Faulkner is probably her predecessor in terms of when he began writing, but he outlives her. He was born in 1897 in New Albany, Mississippi. One of four sons, and he died, I believe, in 1962, so not that long after O'Connor, I believe. Best known for The Sound and the Fury, Absalom, and also, what else is he known for, Bill?
The Reivers.
The Reivers, As I Lay Dying, and so forth. So a variety of famous novels, but Bill is going to introduce us here with a little take from the work we're going to look at, which is a short story. It's called A Rose for Emily. Bill.
Yes. Alive, Miss Emily had been a tradition, a duty, and a care, a sort of hereditary obligation upon the town dating from that day in 1894 when Colonel Sartoris, the mayor, he who fathered the edict that no black woman should appear on the streets without an apron, remitted her taxes, the dispensation dating from the death of her father on into perpetuity. And there you will hear immediately a bit of the craftsmanship that Faulkner was capable of. We have a brilliant interplay there. There's lots of alliteration. We've got consonants, we've got assonants, we've got long, big, elegant sentences here. We've got a brilliant attention to cadence and rhythm. Faulkner was very well known amongst the critics for his attention to the actual oral sound of his writing, whether that be in the short story or larger works like The Sound and the Fury. And there are a number of reasons that, in my view, Faulkner is famous. The Sound and the Fury, I believe, was voted the sixth greatest novel of the 20th century at a certain point. And initially I approached Faulkner with a degree of skepticism, but when I began reading his writing, it occurred to me that, yes, there actually may be something to the claim that this is one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. And I was glad to have encountered him. Unfortunately, I read The Sound and the Fury over 20 years ago. So my memory of it and my memory of my experience of reading it is not as sharp as I should like, but it's not the kind of text you just pick up and read in an afternoon. It is a formidable text. Much more digestible are some of his short stories, the most famous of which, of course, is A Rose for Emily. And oftentimes, this short story, along with Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man Is Hard to Find, are held up as quick, easy examples of the Southern Gothic genre. And just to remind our readers exactly what that entails, these are stories typically set in the American South, Deep South oftentimes. There is a sense of the grotesque to them. There is a sense of the macabre to them. There's a lot of irony to these stories. There's a lots of decay and sentimentality. But it's not treated, the sentimentality isn't treated with that sort of saccharine approach, which you can sometimes get. It's usually very hard-nosed sentimentality, or studies of sentimentality and romance, if you like. And this comes out of not just the Southern Gothic, but also something called the Southern Renaissance. Between the 1920s and the 1930s, there was a broadly based arts movement that grew up in the American South on various centers. New Orleans was one of the big centers for this, and it was primarily a literary movement, but there were other forms of expression as well, whereby Southern artists and Southern writers abandoned the traditional Southern approach to art and narrative, which had indeed largely sentimentalized, in the worst sense of the word, the history and the culture out of which they had grown, and began to look at it with a new sort of a clarity. And really began taking it apart. This brings up another thing we should say about Faulkner. Faulkner early on was heavily influenced by Fitzgerald and Hemingway, to a lesser extent by Steinbeck, to the point where he has certain phrases in his early writing which are almost exact matches for stuff that you can find in Fitzgerald and Hemingway. But he does find his own voice, and it's a very distinctive and rich and eloquent voice. And this brings up another thing I should mention just in passing here. When I first heard Faulkner reading, I was taken aback by his extremely strong Southern accent. And it's an accent which is oftentimes used quite unfairly to portray Southerners in the United States as sort of crude, rude hicks from, who are far away from the cultured life and the intellectual life and what have you. And so it's all the more surprising, perhaps, when we encounter people like Flannery O'Connor, whose knowledge of philosophy and theology is extraordinarily rich and rigorous. And when we encounter somebody like Faulkner, who is an absolutely brilliant craftsman, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to not just his diction, which you heard a short sample here of his diction and his skill with his diction, but also in terms of his rather ingenious ways of handling plot and characterization. I want to say one last thing here before I turn it back over to you, Scott. I consider Faulkner one of the finest crafters of narrative, of plot, in the last couple hundred years. He's extremely imaginative about how he does this. He changes perspective from past to present, from one character to another character to another character, and yet the whole thing flows very smoothly, very logically. The ideological flow it's not hard to grasp how things are moving. And it takes a lot of skill to write like that. And when you stand back and look at it from that sort of technical perspective, you begin to get a sense of what this writer was capable of. And in particular, he was also influenced in his early days, as so many of them were, by the writings of various psychologists, Jung to some extent, but much more significantly Freud. And he took up Freud's psychological therapy of automatic writing, and like a number of other writers, particularly in the US, turned it into stream of consciousness writing. And just again, to remind people what that is, it's the stream of consciousness writing is where the author writes the flow of thoughts and feelings as they're actually occurring in their mind. And so there's no backward, there's no backward looking editorializing for the sake of coherence and logic and flow and things like this. So this to me makes his ability to write these dazzling multi-faceted, multi-perspective plots all the more impressive. This is something he takes to the macro level in The Sound and the Fury, which is broken into 4 sections from 4 different perspectives. And then he uses that as a springboard to do some really quite complex things. But we're not talking about that one today. We're talking instead about the short story. Dr. Masson, tell me a little bit about your impression reading Faulkner.
Well, I had not read A Rose for Emily before, and Faulkner is a new experience for me as well. I've been wanting to read him for years. He's on my to-do list, but I have several to-do lists on my, even in terms of reading. When I did read him, I was struck by, as you said, the prose style, and also a strong sense, which I think is going to remain with me, that this little novella, or this little short story, is saying a bit more than it appears to be saying. It seems to me symbolic in its representations as well. Just to be clear to the readers, stream of consciousness is not the mode in which this particular tale is written.
Yeah.
That would be for The Sound and the Fury, one of the perspectives of stream of consciousness. And it fits the character who's doing the recounting there. It's disconnected, just one thought and then another thought and then another thought, again connected through a long dash. But here we have crafted, grammatically correct, and in many ways quite elegant prose. So and it begins in some ways in the same manner that one of the works we dealt with by Tolstoy did, with the death of the protagonist. And here it also begins with, as I say, it's a rose for Emily, well, Emily, the woman concerned, is actually dead at the beginning. When she died, the whole town went to her funeral, and we're told something about the very varied responses. The men, through a sort of respectful affection for a fallen monument. That's already interesting. The women's mostly out of curiosity to see the inside of her house. You can see the wit here, which no one save an old man, servant, a combined gardener and cook had seen in at least 10 years. Both of them are motivated by things other than an actual affection for the woman, and yet she's of importance. So she's a fallen monument for the men. She seems to me to be a symbol of the Old South, and the novel to some degree characterizes an Old South that is not willing to let itself go on the people of the town, and for that matter, who Miss Emily Grierson is not willing to let go either. That ends up being characteristic of her, is that she clings to the past to the point where, well, we'll leave that for a minute. I won't tip my hand here too much, but she had, as you said, I read this, had been a tradition, a duty, and a care, a sort of hereditary obligation upon the town. So Miss Emily is, she's part of the furniture of the town. She has been bequeathed this sort of dispensation from Colonel Sartoris. Sartoris, I mean, the name itself is symbolic. There's a famous novel by Thomas Carlyle, 1836, called Sartor Resartus, the tailor retailored. It's about being clothed, it's about being fitted, it's being tailored. Well, there's something that's very aristocratic about the whole setting here, and it's been carefully tailored. But what has been tailored is the impressions and so forth, and the clothes don't fit the town anymore, and yet they don't want to get rid of the aristocratic trappings. That seems to me, there's strong symbolism even in the names, and so this is what you were talking about, Bill, at the outset, with the terrific use of language to the point of names and the connotations that arise out of it. And it's all very elegantly and carefully done in such a way that an impression is given to the reader, and a real enjoyment for those who like English prose. So that's my immediate response. And the ending was, I'll say, unexpected.
It's Southern Gothic, so if they've done their job properly, it will be both shocking and unexpected.
It was both. Yes.
Yes, and it delivers. Just a word of warning, folks, we may well spoil the punchline, because there is a big punchline at the end of this story. And so if you're the kind of person who really likes a surprising punchline, you may want to hit pause at this point and go read the story.
Go read the work and then come back to it.
Yeah, no, you're correct. The main character, Emily, is indeed highly and richly symbolic, and I think this ties into this faded, moldering, aristocratic culture that you encounter, and that the Southern Gothic loves exploring. This isn't the big fine Southern mansion. This is the big fine Southern mansion which has been rotting and returning to nature for the past 40, 50 years. That's the kind of setting you'll find in Southern Gothic and the Southern Renaissance, more broadly speaking. So yes, Miss Emily Grierson is richly symbolic to the town of that world that had gone before the war, the antebellum war of the American Deep South. And she represents all sorts of different cultural values in there that are to be respected. So she's her taxes are remitted. She doesn't have to pay taxes. And Colonel Sartoris does this, he says, because it's out of respect for her father, who has died when Emily was 30. And so it's a mark of respect. Does it serve any purpose beyond sort of a symbolic genteel sort of a thing? Not really. But that's the kind of world that, you know, had gone before, where you did things simply because they were honorable and respectful and what have you. Later on, when he's gone and the town tries to return her to paying taxes, she simply point blank refuses. So Emily Grierson shows a bit of an ability to dig in when she wants to, and she's just not going to move. And she does this in other situations. In case you don't get it, it's a short story, but there are several key points where Emily Grierson is just not going to budge on an issue. And I mean, she's really not going to budge.
But look at the subtlety of the account here. So this dispensation that she should not have to pay taxes. It's stated by Faulkner, not that Miss Emily would have accepted charity, which is what it is.
Yes.
Colonel Sartoris invented an involved tale to the effect that Miss Emily's father had loaned money to the town, which the town, as a matter of business, preferred this way of repaying, which of course no town is ever going to do. And the comment, and this is the editors, not the editors, the narrator's comment, only a man of Colonel Sartoris's generation and thought could have invented it, and only a woman could have believed it. So there's a lot of, I would say, I mean, this is not, if this is satire, it is very genteel.
Oh, yes.
Satire. It's not the sort of contempt. There's a love of the thing that he's describing, and at the same time, there's a terrific use of irony here, which is, it seems to me to be of equal opportunity. He's satirizing everyone. Nobody escapes the narrator's satire.
No, and I think he captures brilliantly the complex relationship Southerners have with their past, which is that there is kind of a begrudging admiration. There's a wonder at its detail and gentility and things like this, and at the same time, it's also it's a critique. They know that this isn't, they're not romanticizing this world. It's got major problems with it, and Miss Emily has major problems as well. And here we're going to move maybe a little bit into the plot itself. Her father is an overbearing man, so Emily gets her stubborn streak very honestly, and he refuses to allow his daughter to see suitors until she's about 30, at which point he dies. And if you know anything about that kind of world, 30 is way past your best before date, and the likelihood of her getting married diminishes very significantly, so much so that it seems like that's never going to happen.
Yeah.
Until she meets a northerner. He's a northern laborer by the name of Homer. Again, great choice of names, but you find this kind of these references to the ancient world and ancient literature and ancient mythology actually sprinkled around the American Deep South with surprising frequency. So initially it's surprising to run into a Homer, and then maybe not so much, because we got, as you mentioned, you got the Sartoris character as well. But he's an odd bird, is our Homer. He's a northerner, so immediately there's a symbolic setup waiting to go between somebody who's prototypically antebellum Southern and somebody from the North who's come in. Yeah, and possibly is looking to exploit people in a vulnerable situation in the American South for a great range of reasons. Not quite a carpetbagger. He is a laborer at the end of the day, but still, you get the sense there's something vaguely exploitive about him. And sure enough, he locks on to Mrs. Emily, but he doesn't lock on to Mrs. Emily. There's talk of a marriage, and preparations are made, and then he goes there one night and vanishes, and that's an end of that. And again, Faulkner reveals the grotesque situation carefully, step by step, and you sense what is coming, but not quite head on. She buys arsenic. People frown upon that. What are you buying arsenic for? Maybe it's for rats or something. But nevertheless, there you are. Arsenic. This guy just vanishes, and it seems like she's been jilted by this Homer character. It's said that he prefers the company of men and is not really the marrying type. That's the Southern genteel way of saying that he's actually a homosexual, and therefore this is not really the kind of relationship we could expect to be fruitful. I don't know. Again, Faulkner is very careful. He's very genteel. He'll never take it all the way and tell you the simple, rude fact. You're left with a whole range of eloquent possibilities, some more likely than others. So there's some very careful weaving on the part of Faulkner as he builds the situation. But Miss Emily is also interesting to me, not just for her broad symbolic value of a vanished world. She's also fascinating as an actual individual. She has a tragic individual personal narrative that would be quite rich all on its own in this story. We're not all, even if there were not all these other possible symbolic broad macro references to the American antebellum aristocracy and that world out of which she came. So there's two levels you can read her character: the actual woman herself as an individual, and the woman as a representative of a broad and now lost or vanishing culture. What else do we want to say about plot and character, Dr. Masson?
Yeah, the symbolism I mentioned at the outset from Colonel Sartoris is also there in the title with the rose. Roses are in literature often symbols of secrecy, confidentiality, and so forth. So there's a whole category of legends that are called sub rosa, which here the secrecy is on the part of Emily herself, but also perhaps something between the narrator and Miss Emily. There's a sort of complicity there. There are secrets. There are things that we know in the South about goings on that we don't really want to reveal there. And that's part of the Southern Gothic feel of the whole tale, I would say, is that there's an element of mystery to this, more so than the work we looked at previously by O'Connor didn't quite have the same mysteriousness about it. It didn't have the same richness and tacit things that were being said by not being said. There were unstated things. So even the commentary about the Negroes, which were in both works, here it was presented in the form of what was the phrase at the outset that Colonel Sartoris had. He had fathered the edict that no Negro woman should appear on the streets without an apron. What sort of an edict is that? Extraordinary. It's because it sounds in some ways well, it's micromanaging, to put it kindly, but it also wearing an apron, well, to symbolize the fact that he's a tailor, yes, but also that he is stating that there's a certain social rank that goes with wearing an apron, and women should be acting a certain way. So there are certain ways in which these things that are largely unstated, but nonetheless still have an effect on the reader. And so that's all I would add to that.
Yeah, you get the sense from a comment like that there's an entire narrative strand there with which, if you just pulled on it, there'd be a whole nother story waiting to happen. Exactly. Yes. How did the conversation get to this edict? Also, I'm struck immediately by, of course, his name and the notion of sartorial laws and sartorial rulings. These are rulings that have to do with clothing and costume and what have you, usually taking the form of something like sumptuary laws or stuff like that.
Yeah, and so then you get into etiquette and what the etiquette signifies for those who are living there. And again, the Northerner you mentioned doesn't understand that and doesn't understand the decorum. And to some degree, maybe that brings him into conflict with Miss Emily. She has certain understandings and he doesn't understand what she understands. And so there's a lot of misunderstandings, and it's partly because subtext is not being read very well by the characters. But of course, we, the readers, are reading a text with a subtext as well. So there are layers on which you can read the story. And it all, for me, as somebody who reads professionally, is leads for quite a delightful story.
Yeah, you make actually a good point about the etiquette and the decorum. We have to remember here that the etiquette and the decorum aren't, they are not arbitrary. They serve a purpose. Now, you can agree with the purpose or disagree with the purpose, but you can critique the purpose or various aspects of the purpose of the decorum and the etiquette. But you first and foremost have to understand what it's doing, not just what it is, but what is its function. And then you can say, only then can you say whether or not this is something you are willing to go along with. And as you say, Homer does not understand the nuances of not just the decorum and the etiquette, but what it's supposed to do. And for Homer, the consequences of not doing that.
Not abiding by it.
Okay, this is the last warning, listeners. I'm about to
Go
give the
on.
big reveal here.
Come
Yes.
on.
So Homer vanishes. And of course, after the funeral, everyone wants to get into the house and have a look at this place that has been sealed off. It's a tomb of wondrous mystery, and it's dusty and it's dark and it's dilapidated and full of all sorts of weird baubles and what have you. But they find a room upstairs and the door is locked. And so they break it down. And what should they find on the bed? All these years later, it's our man Homer, or rather what's left of him on one side of the bed, his desiccated corpse, dried and shriveled. It initially stank, and the townspeople said 10 years prior, it must be rats or something that are dying in there. But they went, again, observing decorum, they went by night and sprinkled quicklime around the house and what have you, and the smell soon dissipated, so it's fine. They didn't know that it was actually the decaying and drying out corpse of our man Homer, who seems to have been the victim. It's never said again directly, but he seems to have been a victim of the arsenic that Miss Emily has bought. But wait, it gets more twisted. There is a pillow beside the corpse as well. So everything's laid out very nicely in the bedroom, heavily dusty and what have you. But the pillow beside the corpse has an indent and a single gray hair on it. This is where Miss Emily has been sleeping for who knows how long, right beside the corpse of Homer. So,
Yeah.
and of course,
the body had apparently once lain in the attitude of an embrace, but now the long sleep that outlasts love, that conquers even the grimace of love, had cuckolded him. What was left of him rotted beneath what was left of the nightshirt had become inextricable from the bed in which he lay, and upon him and upon the pillow beside him lay that even coating of the patient and biding dust.
we are.
And she and is in some sense he not the rose for Miss Emily. She's the dried rose of her affections lying beside her on the pillow.
Yeah, the rose is just, you're right. The corpse is like a dried rose, preserved forever.
It reminds me a bit of Miss Havisham from Great Expectations. There's this, right? The jilted lover who
wandering around in the moldering wedding dress all day long. Yes. Yeah. Good. That's a great reference. Yeah, there's also a brilliant sort of thematic elegance, streamlining to this when it all comes together. The whole story in my mind is like, at the thematic level, is like a gigantic periodic sentence. All these little bits and pieces are all sort of floating and working together, but you've got to maintain them all in your brain until you get to that last scene, and then it all gets drawn together. And you realize that cycles of life and death, decay and rebirth and what have you, have been stopped and stunted, both in the individual life of Miss Emily. She will never marry. She will never give birth to the next generation of the Griersons and all the stuff that comes out of that, and the world that comes out of that. And the American Deep South, likewise. It got to an end, came to an end, and what's it going to be reborn as? And the grim answer here seems to be nothing. It will decay like the corpse decays over here, and all the hopes and expectations that came out of that, and the whole thing will return to nature, just as Homer is returning to nature. So the cycle of life and death has been stopped for everybody, with all that goes along with that. Is it morbid? Absolutely. But this classic Southern Gothic is just what you would expect. A horrible twisted turn at the end of the tale. And you'll find a lot of this in a lot of Faulkner's other writings as well. These moments of shock and horror, and the grotesque playing out through these sorts of things. But this is a classic instance of it. And I know even from when I read this as an undergraduate, I still have a freeze frame image in my mind of that dark, gloomy, dusty room with the corpse on the bed, the beautiful monogram toiletry set laid out on the dresser nearby. And it's an image that I'm going to carry with me, I suppose, to my own grave, of this corpse and the indented pillow beside him, and the idea of all that comes out of that. And what makes it even more morbid is that this wasn't just a recent thing. This had become a reclusive lifestyle over a decade, where she had been doing this. I could only imagine what the servant must have been thinking, because he must have been in on the action, as it were. but of course he, as they move into the house to explore it, he quietly, it said he walks out the back and was never seen again.
Yeah.
So he's another vanishing character. There's a whole nother narrative there that we don't get to hear. And this is another thing that Faulkner, I think, does really, really well, is that when you read one of his stories, you feel all the threads of all these other stories, some of which will get told to you, but most of you won't. And in that sense, I think of him a little bit like Tolkien. Tolkien, you feel that there are stories in every directions, but you're only really getting this one, and an occasional echo of these other stories will get mentioned, but you never get the whole thing. And it makes the world in which you find yourself when you're reading Faulkner extraordinarily rich, in ways that other writers can't seem to achieve.
Mm.
What more did we want to say about this story in particular, or Faulkner more broadly?
Well, so here's my, I was reflecting on this, and we've done now 3 Gothic writers in some ways. We did Mary Shelley, so
Yep.
early instance of Gothic, and one of the more famous ones in Frankenstein, although it's quite an odd story as Gothic. It introduces science fiction to some degree, and the themes related to that. And now we've had 2 Southern Gothic writers. Question is, what's with the preoccupation with the Gothic and the setting of the Gothic, and the obviously it's something that the Goths, as in those living in the medieval period, are not interested in this per se. So this is a new type of thing. This Gothic setting and Gothic themes and the preoccupation and the horror, what does it all symbolize? What's the fascination with this morbid fascination amongst very good authors, and for that matter, culture in general? What is with that, Bill? Shall we comment on this?
Yeah, absolutely. The attraction of the horror genre, however conceived, whether that be as Gothic or something else, it seems to be, in terms of literary history, something that waxes and wanes throughout the centuries. And so you have periods where horror stories are really uncommon. There doesn't seem to be much of an audience for them. There doesn't seem to be much of an attraction there. And perhaps that says something about the culture and the zeitgeist of the age. So finding horror stories in our conventional sense are, it's very difficult to do, for instance, during the first half of the Enlightenment or parts of the Renaissance and what have you, and even as you move into the high medieval. But if you go back further and start reading the Norse and the Anglo-Saxon, they love being terrified. They find it highly entertaining again. The Romans had a taste for ghost stories, but the Greeks not so much again.
No.
And so you see this explosion here from about 1800 onwards, with a fascination with the Gothic. And then the Gothic doing what this kind of genre always does, is it begins to split. I think of it sometimes as a cell, and then there were 2, and then there were 4 different subgenres to it, and then there were 8, and so on and so forth. So Southern Gothic is one of these do-it-yourself branches that goes off and begins to splinter, by the way, into its own new forms of literature. And so what is the attraction to this? And I was thinking about this the other day. Probably the most significant early writer around the Gothic to take this up as an object of speculation is Anne Radcliffe. And I'm not sure if I spoke about her during the Frankenstein episode.
I believe we did.
Yeah, so she makes a distinction between terror and horror. And to her, so terror is the anticipation of the dread thing that brings you to the brink of the sublime, but now a very negative, horrific form of the sublime, but it's still the sublime, and therefore it's still attractive. Whereas horror is its actual outplay in the realization of the monstrous thing that was anticipated. And that is kind of a lesser moment. So some people nowadays talk about the terror conducing to what we call the psychological horror, and the horror of Anne Radcliffe conducing to slasher flicks and things like that. So there's kind of a division between those two. And some people have a taste for the psychological, some have a taste for the more visceral horror movies. And so there's a natural split there. So we've got that, the terror of the sublime. I would also add to this that the reason we like being scared by a good, or at least thrilled, because frightened isn't really the right word for a story like this. The reason we find this a rush with A Rose for Emily is because it brings us to the brink of of the Numinous. And then I don't know if I've spoken about the Numinous in here before.
Not
I
sure.
like I like C.S. Lewis's illustration of it. He says, imagine you're in a room and there's a flimsy door, and in the other room you're told there is a 500-pound Siberian tiger. Of course, you're frightened because you're in mortal danger. If that thing gets through the door, you've had it. So you're frightened. But then imagine if somebody told you and you believed that there was a powerful ghost on the other side of that door. And like I said, and you believed it. The species of fear you're feeling for this in the second instance is very different than the type of fear you're feeling in the first instance. And again, it has something of that Radcliffean terror and the sublime to it. And it's interesting to contemplate this sort of thing, and it makes you feel very alive and very invigorated and what have you, even as you're horrified and terrified and all this sort of stuff here. I myself, I find myself attracted to narratives like this. And I've oftentimes wondered what exactly is drawing me into, what is the attraction here? And it's hard to put my finger on it, but of course, if it's the numinous, it would be beyond my ability to merely
You're a sick
encompass.
man, that's all.
Yeah, that's a distinct possibility too. We need to something to do with Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is probably the right one. But yeah, and I also noticed this with certain classes and certain demographics of students. Sometimes I will ask a class who here actually enjoys, let's face it, scary stories. And sometimes I'll have a class of 40 students in front of me and not a hand goes up. And another time, like just the other day, I asked the same question because we were looking at Frankenstein, and every hand with one exception in the classroom went up. They all like it. So immediately I'm immediately curious, what exactly, in terms of demographics here, is making this broad dramatic difference? I haven't got an answer for it, but it's an intriguing question to me.
So the you mentioned the Numinous, the man in the 20th century that speaks to this most at greatest length at any way was a man by the name of Rudolf Otto. He wrote a book called the Idea of the Holy, and it was influential on Lewis. You mentioned Lewis. And his thesis is that this sense of holiness, or the numinous, undergirds all religious experience. So it has to do with the mystery of life, and also the holy otherness of some experience. And my thesis in relation to Shelley, and probably here as well, in relation to Shelley, is that she's writing against the backdrop of modern science and the Enlightenment and its attempt to control nature and to dominate it and to penetrate its mysteries and to do new things. In the case of Frankenstein, to create life out of, butchered corpses and put them together. And there's a sense of desecration that's happened there. And it happens, and science is capable of doing that. But there's a sense that a taboo has been broken and that there are consequences for that. And the consequence is, of course, visited upon the scientist by his creature, the monster. But the real monster in Frankenstein is, of course, the scientist himself, who's broken the sacred taboos of nature and the holiness of life. And really, I think that's what Frankenstein's talking about. Here, it's more a sense of the holiness of tradition. And there's you mentioned the etiquette and the decorum, and there's a certain setup to life, however questionable in certain ways. So the attitude towards the Negroes, the attitude towards the aristocrats as opposed to the hoi polloi and the Yankees and so forth. There's a certain unspoken and probably in some sense somewhat illegitimate establishment there. Nonetheless, there's a sense that modern life is in some sense desecrating the holy order of the past, and so that makes it a fit vehicle for this Gothic sensibility, which conveys again this sense that there's something holy that's been desecrated, and horror ensues. But the horror ensues because we have a sense that something that is in the new order of things is gravely wrong. It violates something sacred, as I said, and I think that's what, and you use the word numinous. That's Otto's word here, and I think it evokes a reaction of silence as well. And there's silence in this novel as well. It's not actually stated what's going on. There's often what we said. There's a subtext here until it's revealed at the end. But there's a power in the tale. That's my best take on it, and it's largely describing a world in which traditional religion has been disregarded, set aside, seen as irrelevant, seen as in some ways obsolete, and yet the notion of the sacred remains with us, and these authors tap into that.
Yeah, maybe here we're getting, in Faulkner's case, closer to some sort of Jungian influence or something of the sort.
Yep.
What struck me as you were talking about that is that Faulkner's stories, one of the things they do extremely well, and they do it through this lens of genteel Southern eloquence, is that they're highly elusive stories. So many things in here. Faulkner lets you draw the conclusions yourself. You make the connections yourself as the reader. And there's something deeply, richly fulfilling about doing that instead of having the writer just tell you point blank. We all know the old axiom that creative writers hear time and again: you must show but not tell. Faulkner does that on steroids. You make your own connection about the fact that he's not the marrying kind and all that implies, and the whole thing with the arsenic, but it's never directly said, and you have to make that connection yourself. But we could go on with example after example in this one short story alone. And this is part of, I think I'm just discovering this now, is that I think this is why I find much of Faulkner's writings highly poetic, because poetry tends to be much more elusive and much less direct. And this is highly elusive prose, and that matched with that wonderful rolling diction that he employs, and those beautiful, long, elaborate syntactical structures. It all comes together in kind of a big package deal. I also wanted to talk a little bit about you're right. There's something about of the religious and the sacred that kind of hangs over, almost like a smell in the air of these stories, and particularly the Southern Gothic. And it's sometimes quite horrific and grotesque, but nevertheless, it's there, and it's very palpable. It's very rich. And insofar as that goes, there's something almost mythological about this. And it struck me again that when Faulkner was writing this, many anthropologists were putting together models of mythology, and pretty well all of them reduced the myths to mere ideological tales. Yes. Tales meant to explain the cause of things.
Yeah. Rationalist.
And it's incredibly reductive. You really, really missed the point. Another writer, in this case, an anthropologist who I have a lot of respect for, Mary Douglas. I think I've talked about her also previously. She wrote a book called Purity and Danger in the early 60s. So just as Faulkner was dying. And there she talks about the power of the taboo and the violations of the taboo violations and violations of the sacred and what have you. So it's a fascinating book. It has a lot of explanatory power. The last thing I want to say here is that Faulkner portrays situations in the American Deep South that he finds problematic, that he thinks are unhealthy, unethical, immoral, and what have you. So the way in which African Americans are treated in the American Deep South bothered him deeply. But like O'Connor, oftentimes because he is a white, in this case, male writer, he is pilloried as being part of the problem and not part of the solution. We have to remember that Flannery O'Connor and Faulkner were on the cutting edge, kind of all alone, of the civil rights movement and helping build momentum there. So it'd be a real shame to miss that with some kind of reductive reading of Faulkner, and Faulkner as a racist, as we would conceive of a racist nowadays in 2021.
Yeah.
Are there problems? There could be. I'm open to the discussion, but to simply reject him, as some might, when he talks about these sorts of issues and tries to deal with how that's playing out in the American Deep South, I think that's a little bit unfair and, again, reductive.
Yeah. No, I agree. There's more to it here, and but the abiding sense is the sense of something sacred that has lost its relevance in the modern world, maybe namely Miss Emily herself, which nobody saw fit into the modern world, and she herself didn't fit into the modern world. She'd become not just wedded literally to the past, but incapable of moving on. And yet she's a monument of sorts, and she's described as a monument, a fallen monument. And what the news of her death, again, I go back to how the men responded, with a sort of respectful affection for a fallen monument. It's not something that they could live with. It's not something that they wanted to remain as it was. They wanted to tax her. She refused to be taxed. That's how the novella began. Nonetheless, there is a clear affection and respect for something that she symbolizes. And again, that holiness about her nonetheless is moldering, just like the corpse of Homer who's beside her in her bed, and with the iron gray streak of hair on the pillow. Again, it's heavily symbolic, and it does give a strong sense that even though the past was something that was in some sense obscene, absurd, garish, nonetheless it's something that has been lost, and we're the poorer for it. So there's a sense that sense of I don't know if it's reverie, but certainly an elegiac sense in the novel, and that adds to the impression that this is a great writer. He conveys that sense to the audience, that for however garish the tale was and horrid it ends, that more has been conveyed than simply a sort of as you say, a horror novel or something. It's not there's much more than that here.
Oh yes. Yeah, I mean, we have it's symbolically she's almost literally married to a figure of death.
Yeah.
And so, you know, instead of marriage conducing to life, she is married to death, and brings out all sorts of rich concatenations in your readings of these sorts of things. And you're right, it's the townsfolk, the menfolk of the town in particular, they have an affection for her, and it's
for what she symbolizes.
Yes, so it is an affection, but I also read it as something of a reverence. But it's a weird, complicated reverence, because it's a reverence for a thing that's extremely problematic. They're proud of it, they're ashamed of it simultaneously.
And it's almost the inheritance of the Old South then.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and it's vexing, and I mean, you can't quite be comfortable with the thing that you're reverencing, but at the same time, it does require reverence, and there's a terrible cost if you don't. This is a dangerous tale in many ways, and it can hide that under a beautiful veneer of eloquence and what have you, but there's horror beneath there. There is horror inside the walls of the text of the structure of the story here, that is housed within. At the center of this whole thing it's not quite a whitened sepulcher, but you get the point. It's a charnel house. There is death within at the core of all of this stuff, and that's what Miss Emily and by way of extension, the American Deep South is married to. It's married to this death. So Faulkner does a tremendous amount of beautiful work in a comparatively short story here. I think it really speaks to his powers, not just as a craftsman, but as a true artist. I mean, this is art, for whatever else you want to call it. Did you have anything further to add, Dr. Masson?
Well, we mentioned the Numinous. I mentioned specifically Rudolf Otto, who was influential on Lewis and also T.S. Eliot. It also should be said. So this work, Das Heilige, or the idea of the holy as it's translated into English, which I recommend. I think it's quite evocative and quite helpful. I'm always curious, and I have been curious about it ever since I came across his work, why this appears in the 20th century. I don't mean Otto's work, but this preoccupation with the holy in a time where Christianity as a public profession is on the wane, and in some ways is being killed off, and purposefully killed off by the intellectual elite. And what it means when an author evokes that same sense in his work and we acknowledge and reverence that? Is there still a religiosity in post, I don't know if this qualifies as post-Christian writing, but it's certainly not explicitly Christian writing.
No,
And
no.
as a Christian academic who is interested in these things and the development of such things, I mean, you mentioned that this, could you say something more about how this appears in the medieval period? And you said they have a fascination with horrible things at certain stages. Is
Yeah,
there, do you have an explanation for that and how that might fit with what we have here?
I do not. I mean,
Okay.
Radcliffe combines or contributes something to the unfinished explanation. Shelley herself does to some extent, as you say. Otto does as well. I think for me, Mary Douglas does as well, but I'm far from an answer yet. But nevertheless, we find ourselves drawn to it. I will say this. We have to remember that I think our hunger for the horror story and for the holy, which there's a connection there.
There is a connection there. I think Otto's onto
tremendous
something.
danger.
Yeah.
And we have to remember, like, especially as it first begins to arise from the book of Exodus and then onwards, that holiness, as we typically understand it traditionally, is, first of all, that's set apart from the everyday by a sense of sacred awe and wonder. But then, of course, it's a smaller subgroup, like a Venn diagram. Then of that stuff, God sanctions those certain things and says, okay, amongst those, these are good. And so we say that's holy. Okay.
Yes.
So it's set apart from the everyday by a sense of sacred awe and wonder. And that awe and wonder can take the form of terror. Sometimes, certainly not all the time.
As it does in scripture.
Yeah. And
the wrath of God and the presence of God destroying.
I see this as part of the image of God in a Christian anthropology and our understanding of who we are in terms of identity. One of the things that defines us is a need for that, a fascination with that. We're drawn to it. We commune with it, even sometimes in its horrific forms. Can I explain that? No, I can't explain that any more than I could comprehend and give you a comprehensive explanation of God. Is something that's bigger than my own psyche and my own mind can possibly get around. I can apprehend it, but I can't comprehend it.
Yeah, no, yeah. So it's something about, even for those who are not going to acknowledge God, acknowledging that there is something awesome about the created order, which even as mundane as we might experience, it remains there. And at times,
yeah, I think it gets displaced to really bizarre, inappropriate places in our time right now, into things like scientism and environmentalism. They try to make these sorts of undertakings do what holy things have done in the past, and of course they can't really support that. But when you sometimes hear these conversations about in the age of COVID, the authority of science, there creeps into many of these conversations, if you're listening for it, that's sacred hush, that awe of, like, this comes to us from science.
And the scientists should be revered as priests, and let's not break the taboo of questioning.
Yeah, and likewise with environmentalism, where sacrifices are going to have to be made on the altar of the environment, and those sacrifices might be you. And that's how this,
you will have no possessions and you will be happy.
Yes, exactly. And again, the same kind of
like Homer.
Yes, you look at figures like Greta Thunberg and people like this. I mean, she is outraged, but she's not just outraged.
No,
you and I would be outraged at somebody cutting us off in traffic or something like that. She's outraged because something holy has been violated, and there's a wrath, and people get behind that kind of thing. They get worked up. There's a religious fervor, and all of a sudden people stop speaking rationally, and they're fervidly pursuing
the understanding of nature has been nature is taken as an ideal, and an ideal that may not be desecrated by carbon footprints, let alone human habitation, let alone human culture, let alone cultivation, let alone agriculture. None of that. I mean, you get a sense that in this sense of the holy is only going to be appeased when there is no more human life. So there's something deeply anti-humanistic about the whole enterprise and the whole conveyance of holiness there that does to some degree fit with this genre of Gothic.
And it gives a lot of explanatory power to the appeal of post-humanism as we're seeing it deploy itself right now.
Yes.
So it works very much hand in glove with concerns for the environment, many of which are totally legitimate.
Yep.
But making it a religious thing, that, I mean, I used to sort of smirk, and I didn't take it very seriously when I heard the first sort of religious tones begin to inhabit conversations about the environment. I thought it was kind of whack job fringe stuff. Nobody's going to take this seriously. How could they possibly take it seriously? And now it's a mass movement held by world leaders oftentimes. So it's, you know, it's not something to be lightly dismissed anymore.
No, indeed. Well, I think that's a good note on which to end it, Bill.
Yes.
I think we're going to circle back on this. You and I had talked about when we finished the planned season 4 to coming back to some of the themes that have come up, maybe revisiting Lewis and Tolkien but these very ideas that we're talking about now, as well as maybe a retrospective on the whole of the 4 seasons that we've put before us. But next week we're moving on to something rather different.
Yeah, it's one of your favorite authors of all time. It's the resplendent Sylvia Plath.
Yeah.
Who is rightly held up as one of the most influential writers and more specifically poets of the second half of the 20th century. That is true. Whether you find that wonderful or lamentable, it's hard to say. Sylvia Plath has an adoring following like few others. She has absolute oceans of fans, quite aggressive fans. So she doesn't need Dr. Masson to contribute. She can do quite well without his immediate and vocal support.
We'll
so
talk about that next week. I'm curious about that. The very phenomena that she has that sort of rabid following is very interesting.
That's right. But that's all we have for you for William Faulkner today, folks. We'd like to thank you for listening. And I am Dr. Bill Friesen. This is Dr. Scott Masson, as always. And this is Paideia Today. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.